all these technical things.
Yeah. I think you have to connect with the video. There's a little video camera, Zenobia, and you
Yeah,
have to
I'm
click
looking.
on it.
I know. I don't see it showing up because we're in the screen that says when system dialog prompts, click open Zoom meetings.
Yeah.
Let me see, launch meeting. Let's try that. Okay, open. Okay, there we go. Can you hear us?
Yes,
Okay.
I can hear you well. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. It'll be 101 in 7 months.
Wow. Congratulations. That is most impressive. Absolutely.
Hi, well, nice to see you again. This is Pat. I last saw you when you came to the station, WTTW, for the Chicago Defender movie, Paper Trail.
Oh, yes.
And I interviewed you then. That was a long time ago now.
Yeah. Well, I don't want you folks to think the old man's memory has been cut short. So there are many things that happen in my life. They're dramatic and romantic and all, but some of them I can't remember details.
I understand that. I'm the same way for my memories. But we can, yes?
Well, I hope that this little conversation can be beneficial to your listeners or viewers.
Thank you.
Because I do feel an obligation to younger people, and everybody's younger than I am, to help them see the world that I lived in and that their older relatives lived in, tracking that history so that they can bring it up to the present and share it with younger people, that the end is not today, but trouble don't last always. Keep on keeping on. Absolutely.
I think that's great for you to share the way you do and make such an effort to educate the current generation, which really, they don't know much about the past. So that's a great thing you do. I've watched some of your interviews and read some of what you've written. And so what we're doing is this film on World War II. And you were actually in the main battle from Normandy going across. Our film is about the second campaign that came in down from the south, like near Marseille, where you were later on. That second campaign that came up and went across up towards Strasbourg. But what we want to include, we're getting stories from some veterans, or we're getting stories from some historians, but we would love to hear about your experiences coming into being drafted and going into training, some of the, just kind of walking through your experiences. So shall I just jump into it and ask the questions that I'd like to ask you? Can I proceed? Or do you have any questions first for me?
Well, for me, I want to give the viewers or the listeners understand that African Americans are American. And in World War II and previous wars, African Americans, regardless of how they may have been treated, operated as devoted, loyal African in the American system. And they were American. And we found that to be an important factor as we moved from the borders of Europe into the Soviet Union, into the early, across Germany, that we were American. And though the enemy tried to separate us along race lines, they couldn't do it. We were Americans, determined to help America be victorious with the dedication that when we returned home, we would make the leadership fulfill the promise that was made in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Not that all men, but all human beings are created equal. This is a goal that we inherited from our American experience, transferred as much as, and determined to carry forward, even at 100 years and 7 months. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope it's useful
Thank
to
you.
your viewers or listeners.
It is useful, very much so. You were about 22 years old when you entered service in the military?
Yes.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you're a young adult.
I was drafted. Pardon?
What were you doing? You were living in Chicago at the time. What was were you married or were you working somewhere? Can you tell me about your life on the eve of war?
Well, I was drafted. Now, many of my friends, some who were volunteers in the Tuskegee Airmen, but many of my friends were in the Army and working for, they were there. I was not. I was working as an insurance agent for what was then a Black-owned and controlled insurance, Metropolitan Assurance Company, which had started as Metropolitan Burial Society. And that was typical of the South Side of Chicago and many other cities in that period of time. And when D-Day, well, before D-Day, the draft, the volunteers were there, but the draft notice was spent, and I was about 22 years old when I was about to be drafted. My brother had already been, Walter Black, had already been drafted. Now, we took the officers' candidate tests to be commissioned officers. Now, we had some volunteers who were already commissioned officers from the 8th Regiment Armory. And yet the test was for all potential soldiers, and some of us passed it at a pretty high rate. And Leon Dash's father, Leon Dash, now Jr., is now a professor at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and you may want to talk with him about his father's experience. We were together. He was from New York, I was in Chicago. We were buddies in terms of the French experience, the American Army. We were in the same unit, the 308th, I forget the name of it, but we were in the same unit. He was a sergeant, I was a private, but we were friends all the way from the day we entered the Army until we returned.
Before the war, were you aware of the efforts of CORE or the NAACP? Were you kind of keeping up with that?
Well, NAACP and the Urban League established in the early days of the migration from Blacks from the South to the North and the defense of Blacks in the South and the North. Those were organizations that we pre-teenagers and teenagers inherited from our parents, who were in that time, the parents who had brought their children from the South to the North to have an opportunity to live a better path, were very active in community affairs. And the NAACP and the Urban League were just examples. And the Chicago Urban League and NAACP was very, very active in educating us about the social conditions and how we could change it and behave while we were changing it. And
I know that you go on to become a distinguished leader.
Being a loyal American was part of that.
Okay,
I'm
that's
sorry.
very good. Very good. I was saying I know that you go on in your lifetime to become a distinguished civil rights leader, and I was just wondering if you, even before the war, you were already thinking about these things, and you were. If you were already in high school, for instance, it sounds like you were already thinking about change and how it might take place.
Well, yes. My father and mother, who were the children of former slaves, and they had themselves been sharecroppers, had fled the South, as many in that period, from the beginning of World War I to the beginning of World War II, had fled the South in order to have the opportunity to vote, and they voted, and that's another story, to also be able to physically fight back with some degree of possibility if they were attacked by members of the Ku Klux Klan, that racist group that still exists, and to get better education, quality education for their children. And so most of their children of my generation, we graduated at least from high school, and we were loyal Americans for the most part, who wanted to break the barriers of segregation, and the Army was just one example of breaking that segregation. So the people who left the South and moved to cities like Chicago and Detroit and New York, they had their own Army units to volunteer, called the ROTC in Chicago. They were volunteers that in any case, they would be volunteers in the combat of the front line of the Army of the United States. That was their mission. And many of them were friends of mine. I wasn't in that group.
So I'm thinking about the fact that segregation, formal segregation, was in the South for the most part. Informal, some segregation in the North too, but I'm thinking that once you entered the military, you probably experienced the most segregation you've ever experienced because you grew up in Chicago. Can you talk about that experience? To go from a pretty free environment, I mean, you could go to what restaurants you wanted. There was a separation, formal separation of the races. But when you go in the military, there was. Can you talk about that, what that was like?
Well, in the military, people like me from New York and Chicago and Detroit, we were drafted. We didn't volunteer, most of us. We were drafted into the Army. And in the units into which we were drafted for military training, we were sent south. And though many of us had been south under very carefully organized in high school, DuSable High School, where I graduated from eventually, the coach would take us to play high schools, black high schools in the South, but we were coached and protected on our behavior. So we didn't feel the dramatized of racism as much. In the Army, however, I was in Camp Fort Lee Virginia, I think right outside of Petersburg. And we couldn't go, even though we had on our soldier suits, we couldn't ride the bus in terms of just getting on and sitting down. If we went into shop, if a white person who didn't have a uniform on, male or female, came in, even though we were locked into time limits, they could come and get in front of us. So we were always in the back. And if we were in the town and a white person happened to be, a white woman in particular, happened to be coming on down the street, even though we had a soldier suit on, we had to get off that curb to let her pass. And so many of the African-American draftees had not made weren't able to make that adjustment and refused to make it. And so many of them were imprisoned, even though they were army. And one of them was, well, I'm trying to think of some of the famous, one of them became the first Major League Baseball player, Jackie Robinson. He was an officer and he didn't get off the bus, didn't back up onto the bus in Little Rock, Arkansas. And he was arrested and eventually given a discharge. And when he was finally in the major league, they changed that discharge for him, discharged without honor. So I give that story and to give the listener, the viewer, an idea about race in America post the slavery period as it continued. But even in the military, we had that continuing racist experience. And many of the African Americans that passed, including Leon Dash Sr. and maybe even Timuel Black, had passed the Army General Classification Test with a high score to become commanding officer, and their commanding officer may have taken it 2 or 3 times, which was denied the opportunity. And that person would be the commanding officer. And that was the way in the organizational way in which we went into World War II and overseas. My unit was though the younger people particularly wanted to be in the combat units, they were service units, and many of the blacks who wanted to be, particularly young ones and others, in the battleground as part of the battle, they were not, but they were in service units. Now, we went into, I stopped in the British Islands in England, but then we finally were ordered to go into Europe, into France, D-Day, by the man who became the 5-star General, Dwight Eisenhower, and our commanding officers. We were to go into Europe, into France, and that was the thing that became D-Day.
Absolutely.
But we carried, what I'd like to insert, though we had to endure, had been invited and had to endure the separation of race issues, we felt American. We felt loyal to the cause of, of, of equality and justice for all people. And though fascism, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, were not equalitarians. They were primarily, before they were racist in their final behavior. And so those of us who went into the army with the idea of equality, and though we were not treated as equal, we felt a responsibility and a determination to defeat anyone, anywhere that was opposed to equality. And so we went into the army, drafted or volunteered with a spiritual attitude of equality for all people. And so we went into France with that attitude.
Was there any organizing going on within the military, within Vicor or any other groups, groups from America? Was there any effort to get more organized while you're in the military so that when you get home, you could work together for change?
Now the members of CORE, and by the way, Congress of Racial Equality had its beginning in the area of the University of Chicago, started by friends of a young man, I forget his name, who was in the divinity school at the University of Chicago. And he went to get some coffee or rolls in a restaurant on 55th Street, and he was denied, and his fellow, the people who were in the school at the university with him, they formed CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and carried that attitude. Though they were separated individually, they carried that attitude into the army. And to the extent that they had to, and I was one, organized for the idea of equality, they did that even in the army, but not in conjunction with the enemy. It was in the unit that they would happen to be a part of, and that was not to be carried anywhere else. Now, this may sound complicated.
No, it makes sense. And I was just wondering if you came across that or found yourself becoming more engaged during the military, during your time in service, and if conversations were taking place among y'all saying, you know, when we get home, we're going to make some changes. I didn't know.
And we have many, Milton Cohen and many others that friends that I had met as CORE organized. I met them because I lived close to where I am now. I lived in the Grand Boulevard neighborhood and around Vernon and King Drive. We were friends in terms of social operations, in terms of segregation and all that. So many of them had been in the Jewish struggle in Portugal and became members of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and then drafted into the Army. So there was a continuation, though there was not, we were separated racially, there was an attitudinal continuation wherever we went to be Americans, but also to struggle for equality, even in the armed forces. And so one of the reasons that Tim Black never became a commissioned officer, and even a non-commissioned, it was always a PFC, because the commanders, who usually were Caucasian, Southern white, they did not want to feel that there was a leader who had been appointed in their unit who was opposed to segregation. So that's a complication interior to America and it exists today. But the attitude of change is greater now, I think, than it was even then.
Would you mind describing all the ways that life was segregated for you in the military? If you could talk about these things, we can show it on film later on and as part of our education process. So could you just kind of walk us through how it was segregated in the camps first, starting in training?
Well, as I had indicated, not having been victimized by segregation as being protected, even when I was in the South, I had not experienced. But when I was drafted, I was sent to Fort Lee, Virginia. It was a military base for training right outside Petersburg, Virginia, and near a black, I forget the name of the college and university, but we, inside the camp, because of the segregation, we were in a unit that was segregated. And only when we went on a trip to Richmond would we feel the racial segregation. And because we were not accustomed to that, very often we were in violation of the cultural and maybe even the legal. And sometimes that called for military arrest and prosecution.
You mentioned
and so we had to be very careful. My brother was in a training camp in North Carolina. And though he had graduated from the University of Illinois and had a strong academic background, and he had passed the Army General Catechism with a high level, and he was a master sergeant. He couldn't go to officer. He had to be careful also. So that was typical all across the South particularly. So we felt on a personal level the lack of equality for men, mostly men. There were Black women who were not soldiers, but service people. we felt that. And that was kind of the feeling of the spirituality that we felt later expressed as Dr. King, we shall overcome. And believing that our services were going to be needed in the war, we were not prepared to do anything but serve as Americans, even with the segregation, even with the racial abuse that Black had to endure during that period, until we were brought out of that into units like the one which my friend Leon Dash and I served, 308th. We were service unit, railhead, 308th railhead unit in Europe when we went. So it's a hard thing to understand how we made that adjustment, but it gives the listener, the viewer, an idea of what we had inherited from our parents and parents, grandparents, that the future was going to be better, and that we had inherited the legacy that they had carried forward during the slave period and later, and so forth had moved forward. We felt an obligation to that legacy to keep on keeping on. And I tell this story because I feel an obligation, even at 107 months old, to the younger generation who now live in a much more complicated world than the one in which I grew up, that they too have an obligation to do the best they can. And this goes past race, in the name of the past, because they owe it to grandpa and grandma who gave up so much so that their children and grandchildren could survive and keep on keeping on. So World War II, in terms of French particularly, the obligation that we felt in going into Europe and all the way up into Germany, seeing some of our comrades perish, made us more obligated and dedicated to carry our attitude and spirit to the future. So France, as we saw and met Americans, Josephine Baker being one who left Chicago and found the roots, found a spirit in Paris and greeted us. And Django Reinhardt, who was a French musician, Stephen Grappelli, they all met us and enjoyed. And Black musicians who had been inducted had organized music units even in the combat era to help us feel a sense of of having a good time. So it seems incredible that people would be playing music, jazz and blues, and we would be bouncing with our rifles in our hand, but just being friendly, prepared to move on up to the front. Now that's a fact that I experienced. I can't remember all the names, but ask your older relatives who may have had similar experiences, what it was like. That's France.
That's great. That's in France. That was in France. All right. You know, one thing about in the film, when we watch movies about World War II, it's always about the riflemen, and they seem to be the only ones who did anything dangerous. Was it life dangerous for you as a quartermaster? Can you speak of that?
Do.
Can you explain how, well, sometimes people think that the war was only carried out by the riflemen, the combat soldiers at the very front. But I know that the people who supported the military and went in can you talk about how the role of the quartermasters, what the role they played, and also, was your job dangerous?
Oh, we were targets of the enemy. If they cut, you see, the quartermasters and other service units, and I forget how to describe them, without us, the combat units would not have any supplies to work with. They wouldn't have any ammunition, they wouldn't have any food, they wouldn't have anything without. My unit was so close that we were bombed regularly. And even this is a story that made me, the enemy had drafted supporters of Hitler from America who spoke English and knew what the New York Yankees and all, and brought them, and they would drop behind our lines for the purpose of destroying our supplies or us. Another part of that story that seems impossible. We had treated the German prisoners that had been captured and were doing the hard, dirty work in our unit. We had treated them so well that they came, and I say this as a personal experience. They came and told us that these English, American-speaking people had been dropped in to help destroy the supplies. They told us these German prisoners who had been treated humanely after they were prisoners felt an obligation. Now that seems hard to understand, but the human spirit carries us beyond the immediate. And so when we treated them so well, though they were doing the hard, dirty work under our supervision, they felt an obligation to tell us when we were being threatened in terms of destruction of the supplies. The supplies which were because the German military had been kind of been overcome almost. They didn't have the supplies and the space to move in. They were targeting, more specifically, the units of the American army that supplied in order to cut those supplies off from the combat. And so, however they could do that, they were going to do it. But In my unit,
Aerial?
308, we, pardon?
So
We treated
they did
them after.
sabotage, but you also got aerial attacks on your units. Like, would they try to bomb or send aircraft?
Oh, regularly. We were bombed. We were fired on. We were targeted. If they cut the supplies, I'm just using my unit as one of the service. If they cut the supplies, how would the combat soldiers function? They couldn't. So the supplies were, again, taken up into the front line by African Americans, usually driving the trucks or using a means of transportation to get them up. And on their way to those front lines, they were targeted to be bombed. And I never saw anyone who could drive a truck while standing with one leg on the outside and head to avoid and move the truck. They weren't going 60 miles an hour, they were going slow. But guide the truck with that one leg inside, but with his head outside, knowing that the inside was being targeted of the carrier. So when we deal with this idea of World War, any war, and we say the functions of all is to survive, and they become creative in that demand, that function. And so our soldiers would be, they would be felt obligated to take the supplies, the ammunition, the food, whatever's necessary, to the front line. And they wanted to do so successfully. Now, they weren't always successful, but that was the attitude. And so not only the identification and the cause was carried from World War I and Civil War to us, we felt an obligation to continue and carry that. But at the same time, the spirituality of our lives made us feel obligated to help the enemy to become more. It's a complicated kind of feeling, but that is what the spirit of life demands of all people, even in war. And so when we went up into France, it was so encouraging to hear vive la Britain, vive l'Amérique, vive le Russe, long live. But when we marched,
can you paint a picture of the liberation of Paris, what you saw there? Was that pretty amazing when you got into the city?
Oh, in Paris, yeah. We went to the statues and I forget the names of all of them. We, and the nightlife, the nightclub where Josephine Baker become famous, because though the Germans had invaded and conquered that part, there was what I heard, an agreement, military agreement between the enemy and Ellis, that Rome and Paris would not be bombed. They would be fired on, but not bombed, because of the history that both of them carry. And that's another complication. It's hard for people to understand. And so in Paris, I'm trying to think of all the visiting sites, but as soldiers, we were taken to those visiting those places, as well as the nightlife that had existed in that area, and we enjoyed the beyond race. We enjoyed the feelings that the French people carried to us, and they were grateful. They were very grateful that their city, their country was being liberated. Now, another part of the story is that when France was under the control of the Nazis, the Germans, there were younger people, male and female, and created an underground, what we call an underground force, to combat that invasion by the Germans. And so they were unified and enthusiastic about it. So when we came into France, they were enthusiastic. They joined us to give directions about the best procedures that we could use in order to expedite our mission of clearing the land and moving forward into Belgium and later into Germany. So our French experience beyond race was a beautiful experience about race, because we saw the Josephine Bakers and other people of color being treated by the French as gems of talent. And then with other musicians and other people, the Americans, some of which I knew from childhood, that was that feeling of brotherhood and sisterhood that made us happy that we had helped in the liberation of Paris and the French. So it was a great experience that we had in that liberation of France, and that we carried forward into Belgium and other. America had been very generous to the allies, our allies in France and Belgium and the Netherlands, in terms of help with food and other things that they were being deprived of under the Nazi and the fascists, that is Germany and Italy under Hitler and Mussolini. So the French experience was, for me, a beautiful experience. And I've been back several times since then to recall my time during World War II in France.
Were you tempted to stay in France and just live there?
Pardon?
Were you tempted to just stay in France like some other Americans did? Was that a temptation, just stay and not go home?
There was a feeling about that because we were treated so, in terms of people that I know, they were treated so generously and fairly as many of the musicians that had traveled there, that they felt that was more like home than where they were reared and brought up in America. So in the Netherlands and in France, that universality created a feeling of happiness and joy about life itself. I didn't, because I had an obligation to come back home, but yes, I felt an attraction to live in that beautiful city, Paris.
Now, I hate to move to the now a bad memories, but you must have gone through constant destruction. I mean, as y'all moved and followed as the army moved forward, you must have just seen destruction after destruction.
What was that last one?
You must have just seen constant destruction as you crossed, from France and Netherlands into Germany. What was that like to be confronted with all that destruction? What did you see?
Well, our combat troop that we serviced went into the areas where the concentration camps, even though they had been in front combat, they came back to us in a unit and expressed. Our commanding officer, who didn't like me, but we jumped into a Jeep and went after, I forget the name of the concentration camp. From Liège, Belgium, we went into Germany. And I never had seen such an organized, systematic destruction of human beings. We could smell the odors before we got to, and then when we got into camp, oh, I forget the name of the camp.
Buchenwald, or
Buchenwald, yeah, that's it. Thank you, thank you. We went into Buchenwald and systematically seeing human beings destroy one another. Bodies laying on top of other bodies. And I could speak a little Yiddish, a little German, so I asked one of the people, how could you let this happen? And she replied to me, Mister, it wasn't us, it was the Fuhrer, talking about Hitler. But the actual storage and destruction with them, but transferring that in terms of attitude and feeling to someone else reminded me of the human experience in America and slavery and other. And then later, when we were getting ready to go to Asia, and we dropped an atomic bomb, my feelings were similar, human beings destroying human beings, how we could destroy a whole city of human beings and still claim that we were being humanists. That was another, idea that helped some of us come back home determined to help make this not just a better United States, but a better world. I said to my fellow soldiers as we were getting ready to board the ship, that I would have rather, though I didn't volunteer to be in the Army and had been through 4 major, I would rather have gone to Hiroshima, than to have that happen to those people. And I said again to them, my fellow soldiers, there's no monopoly on intelligence. And if you have intelligence, you can get knowledge. And if you have knowledge, you can use it any way you wish. That was what I said in those days of, I think it was 1943 or 44, whatever. Today, because people have intelligence and they have gained knowledge, in the present world that we live in, there are several countries which have acquired atomic weapons that could destroy. That one that we dropped on Hiroshima are obsolete now. They could destroy a city as big as Chicago if we do not make the necessary destruction and agreements. Today we live in one world more than we did during World War II, because the technology of communication of all sorts is much greater now, and it's much more crucial that we understand the Hitler, who my high school teacher used to send us home to listen to Hitler as he was being broadcasted. And at the end of every speech that he would make, this was WGN, I think, he would end by saying, Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. Germany, Germany, Germany all. And when I hear some of our leaders similarly expressing America as it used to be, America as it used to be, I began to think about slavery and all. But modern design of what would be slavery and encouragement. And even at 101 and 7 months, then I still feel an obligation to transfer that feeling and experience of World War II and the experience that my mother and father talked about in World War I and before. So I try to be available to communications experts like you folks are, so that you can give one man's experience and opinion to many others. I want to thank you very much. I hope this has been useful.
It has been very useful. I really appreciate you taking your time to talk with us through these things, and we'll be able to share it with a bunch of people through the film. Do you want to say what it was like coming home? Did you come back through New York, or how did you get home, and what was it like? What was the feeling like to come home?
Oh, Barnard, that's another story. We, having gone through the segregation and the destruction, we came home on a boat that was also racially segregated. And when we got into New York Harbor, there was a flag, the American flag, and I think we were singing. They were singing. I was on a lower level. I came up and I first felt a feeling of having experienced that segregation and what I saw, that I didn't want to make that salute to American flag. But coming up in the harbor, hearing the music, and then seeing the flag, I came up and gave my salute to the American flag. It may seem complicated to you younger folk, and everybody's younger than Tim Black, but if you can talk with your older relatives, there will be similarities that you see in what they have to share. And so those of us who've been through the experiences in Asia and Europe during that period of the World War II and the earlier period of the Great Depression, which was, and see and feel though we lived in the Great Depression because of the spirituality of life for all of us. We lived in the Great Depression, but most of us were not depressed. We had the attitude as expressed by our ancestors. I'm so glad the trouble don't last always, the spirituality. And that carried us through World War II. The French experiences made us feel a kinship, a friendship that helped us feel that we had done a good job in breaking the barriers of fascism of Hitler in that country and moving forward to a better world. And so that's part of my story and experience of World War II and my French experience. My unit, 308, 4 battle stars, 4 American battle stars, and the French Croix de Guerre with palm. So we were there, even though we were service, we were in the combat area and were combatants.
Did you make any friends?
Okay.
Did you make any friends with Black soldiers from the South who thought about maybe moving north after the war? Did you make any friends, or did you hear any talk about, or did y'all say, hey, y'all got to get out of the South and come to the North like the rest of us? Was there any of that conversation going on?
Oh, yes. Many of my fellow soldiers, my younger soldiers, they were from the South, and had volunteered to be in the Army. And they seeing the difference, and in terms of the training service, many of them had been in the North. They were determined, and that's the beginning, as we might know, that's the beginning of the second great migration to the North. Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, St. Louis. The difference is they had been denied the opportunity to get education at all. I had never seen in my life young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, who couldn't read and write, except when I was in the Army. But they could shoot. And when we get fishing, they could fish. They could shoot, but they could not read and write. Now, they had been denied that opportunity because they learned to speak French very quickly with the pretty French girls. But during World War during World War II, Mr. Carl Hansberry had carried, Lorraine Hansberry's father, carried a second case to the Supreme Court, which made restrictive covenants, that is, unenforceable anywhere in the country. And my generation, returning from World War II and living in an overcrowded community, the Black community in Chicago was 4 times overpopulated than the Caucasian community, which might be just east, west, north, or south. As Robert Abbott called it, he called it, had a special name for it. And so those of us returning from World War II, having the advantages of the GI Bill of Rights and being old enough and starting families, we immediately moved out of the old neighborhood, taking with us our experience and our advantages, and the newcomers who didn't have the southern opportunities or the northern opportunities, moving to the north, they brought less, hadn't been allowed to vote, and so they were exploited because we separated from my generation, who had moved out of the old black belt, as Robert Abbott called it, the black belt, and left our less fortunate brothers and sisters without our help, which my mother and father had enjoyed for their children, the typical. So there was an isolation then, not just among racial, but class. So there was a separation that was twofold and has been used by opportunists. The separation is not only racial, but class distinctive, which can be measured. But again, when we see the behavior of younger people, Asian, Caucasian, African American, Native American, when we see the behavior, it's inspiring to believe that these young people, with their inherited intelligence, are working to make this world a better place as my generation, even with the segregation of World War II, worked when we returned home to make this nation a better nation with equality and justice was available to all. It's that optimism that we in my generation and right below feel responsibility to carry. And education, I'm bothered now about the medical crisis which separates so many people, and hope that somehow our ministry and our politicians and our educators can close that gap that has suddenly been opened all over the world without a war being a part of that. And that optimism is part of life that makes life worth living. Go to bed, get a good night's sleep, get up tomorrow with something to do. And that is making your neighborhood, your school, all of those things that we need better for all people who have to live in it.
Amen.
I hope this has not been too boring.
No, not at all. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. I really, really admire it. I wish I could be there in your presence and talk for hours with you at ease, you know, but I love this opportunity to get to visit with you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I do. Well, thank you so much. I've got Pat on the line there. She's been muted. I think we're good to go, don't you?
I had a couple more questions with your permission. Okay.
Pat would like to ask you 2 questions.
For a short time, you were sent from the camp in Virginia up to Pittsburgh, a camp near Pittsburgh. You mentioned that in your book. And there was a racial incident that occurred there. Could you tell us about that? Do you remember that?
Who was that now? I'm sorry, I didn't.
An event that happened at the camp near Pittsburgh. There was a racial violence, I think, against someone there. She wanted to know if you could remember that, what happened. You had written about it before, or she read you had talked about it at a camp near Pittsburgh.
Which town was this?
This is before you've left for Europe. Something happens. Pat, can you tell us more about it?
Yes, for a short time you were sent to a camp near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I believe. Can you?
Oh.
Yeah, and something happened there, a racial incident. Do you remember that? Can you tell us?
I remembered, but I can't remember the details. Something did happen.
Okay, may I correct your memory? Yes.
I wish I could, but yes, something.
I understood that there were certain towns that Black soldiers were allowed to go into, and certain towns that they were forbidden to go into, as well as different theaters and entertainment venues. And
that's right, and I just can't recall the detail. So many things were happening.
All right. You had written that a Black soldier went into a theater that he was not allowed to go into, and he was shot and killed by the military.
That's right. That's right. You bring back the memory. I wish I could remember all the detail, but so many things were happening that I can't. I wish I could.
All right. If you can't remember it, we don't want you to say it then.
No, I can't remember the details. I remember the incident. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that was. We were in camp outside of Pittsburgh, right outside of Pittsburgh. But I can't remember the details of the incident you're talking about.
All right. And then also, if Black soldiers were caught fraternizing with the British girls or the French girls, what happened? Were they reprimanded? Were the Black
Was that in France?
Or in England especially, I think you mentioned that there was a black soldier who was hanged in England on the accusation of rape. Do you recall writing about that, or do you want to tell us anything about that? Somebody in your unit was.
Well, oh yeah. There was a shortage of males around almost any place where we were at that time. And the young, beautiful, intelligent females, when these young blacks came on the scene, there was a courtship almost immediately. But the black male would be arrested and charged with some kind of charge. I forget what it was, but in order to separate him legally from this beautiful young woman who had created a partnership with this smart, good-looking young soldier. That was not unusual.
And then,
so the point is, however, is race mattered then, and in some maybe subtle ways continues to exist. Not so much observable as it was then, but the victims feel it, and those who lived it remember it as their part of the American experience. But the continuation of determination to make America as it ought to be, as an example for the world, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That for young people, particularly, with the new military technology that I've described, is also almost a mandatory factor if we are to continue to exist. And the French experience, the European experience of World War II gives evidence of what can be and what should be, and also what should not be, as Hiroshima and Nagasaki give in World War II that negative experience of what can happen. But the Parisian experience gives an example of what ought to happen. That is the French experience, liberation of human beings. Carries me back to the slave period, where blacks and whites in cooperation with the military as well as political of Abraham Lincoln and the guidance of Frederick Douglass, who told Lincoln, free the slaves and win the war. And only when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War become a victory for the Union rather than a Confederate. And only when there was a unity in World War II of allies like France, Great Britain, even radical social like the Soviet Union in America, when there was a unification that struck out against fascism and Nazism, did the world come to another level of human, of course, racial, gender, and all the other dividing lines.
Yeah.
One last question.
I've exceeded my ability to record, so
Right.
we'll
Okay.
beyond it, so I can't.
Does that help this young lady?
It did. It did. Thank you so much for all that you've done. I really appreciate it. I'll be in contact with you and share some of what we do with it.
Please do. Please do. I would like to have a copy once you get it organized so that I can put it into my archives.
Yes.
Which the Vivian Harsh collection of the Carter G. Woodson. And the Carter G. Woodson experience is quite a story in itself that I have put together and increasing for all people, and Caucasians as well as can share the experience of one African American and others, but share that as a personal gift.
That's great. I would love to find out what all's in that archive and have a look at it. This is my third documentary film that I'm making. My second documentary film was about a Black doctor who arrived in a small Appalachian town in 1914. He had grown up in Raleigh and went to a Black medical school in Memphis and had planned to move north. Was only going to make some money in this little town, but he ended up falling in love with the town and spent the rest of his life there. And most of his patients were white, and the town came to love him. And I thought, since you're stuck at home, I could send you my documentary because you might enjoy watching that and finding out about his experiences.
Send it through my wife, Zenobia.
Yes. Yeah, you can watch it on the computer. I've got it on YouTube. You can watch it there.
Okay.
There.
Then you can get it to her and therefore to me.
Good, good. I'd like to know what you think about this Dr. Branch fellow. He was great. I loved working on him for a couple of years, but I never got to meet him, and very limited amount of his own writing, but I still was able to put together his story. It takes some interesting turns that you'll be intrigued with, I think.
Okay.
Again, thank you so much. We'll be in further communication with you, and we'll certainly make this available to you for your archive.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zenobia. Really appreciate it. If
Yes.
you're around.
Your wife went to a lot of work to set this up.
Okay. Yeah. Well, she wants my story to be available to everyone because it's part in our 40 years of being together is part of her story.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Well, we'll be in touch again soon.
Nice.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Dankeschön. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup as well. Très bien.
Okay.
Au revoir.
Bye.
Vive la France.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In English, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Goodbye then.
Okay.